In 1977, a series of violent crimes took place on the Ohio State University campus. Now, this triggered an investigation that would end up challenging the very foundations of American law and even our understanding of what it means to be a person. What started as a hunt for a serial rapist quickly unraveled into one of the most complex and frankly baffling psychological cases ever put on record. Right from the beginning, the investigation was wrapped in this profound mystery. The victims, though deeply traumatized, gave descriptions that just didn't add up. They talked about an attacker whose entire personality seemed to shift right before their eyes. It was a puzzle that was about to take investigators into completely uncharted territory.
So to really understand this case, we have to start exactly where law enforcement did, with the crimes themselves. A series of attacks that were as terrifying as they were bizarre.
Okay, so it's October 1977, and a real sense of fear is gripping the OSU campus. 3 different women in 3 separate incidents are abducted, robbed, and raped. The attacks were bold, they followed a similar pattern, and it all suggested a single person was responsible. But that third attack, that's where the case got its first crucial break, and the police moved in quickly to make an arrest. Almost immediately, investigators ran into this huge contradiction. On one hand, you have the hard evidence, and it's crystal clear. Fingerprints from the crime scenes, physical descriptions. It all pointed to one guy, a man named William Stanley Milligan. But then you have the testimony from the victims, and it tells a totally different story. They described a man with a thick Slavic accent, another who was gentle and apologetic. One was aggressive, and another seemed almost like a little kid. How could one man be so many different people?
So, with a suspect in custody, the case seemed like it was heading towards a pretty straightforward prosecution. But when the authorities actually started questioning Billy Milligan, the story took a sharp, really unprecedented turn. And the charges against him were incredibly serious, reflecting just how violent these crimes were. We're talking 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of rape, multiple counts of robbery. He was looking at a life behind bars, and the prosecution thought they had a slam dunk case. After all, the physical evidence tied him directly to the victims. But Milligan's reaction to his arrest wasn't what anyone expected. He wasn't defiant, he wasn't sorry, he was just completely confused. He would later say that he just woke up in his jail cell, with no memory of how he got there or why. He claimed that huge chunks of his life were just gone. He called it lost time. And his panic, by all accounts, seemed genuine, like he was hearing about these horrible crimes for the very first time.
Now, to even begin to understand what was going on in Milligan's mind, you really have to go back to his childhood. And honestly, it's just a catalog of horrors. After his biological father died by suicide, his mother remarried a man named Chalmer Milligan. This man subjected Billy to the most sadistic physical and sexual abuse imaginable. At one point, he apparently even threatened to bury him alive in a barn. Even back then, teachers noticed he seemed detached, confused about who he was. This wasn't just a tough childhood, it was a foundation built on profound, repeated trauma.
Milligan's defense team started to sense that his confusion was something more than just simple amnesia. So they pushed for a full psychological evaluation. And the results, well, they would completely transform the case from a standard criminal trial into a landmark moment in the history of both psychology and law.
The psychologists came back with a diagnosis of what was then called multiple personality disorder. Today, we know it as dissociative identity disorder, or DID. And it's really important to understand what this means. The theory is that when a child goes through trauma that's just too overwhelming to handle, the mind can do something radical to protect itself. It splits. It creates these separate identities, or alters, to hold the pain, the anger, the fear, and this allows a core part of the self to stay unaware, almost as if the trauma never even happened.
During his evaluations, the doctors didn't just find 1 or 2 of these alternate personalities. They eventually identified 24 distinct people, all living inside Billy Milligan's mind, each with their own name, their own age, their own memories, and even their own skills. Of those 24, 10 were considered the prominent ones around the time of the crimes. And these weren't just moods, they were fully formed identities. You had Arthur, a sophisticated, rational Englishman who was often in charge. There was Alan, a con artist, Tommy, an escape artist. There were also children, like David, an 8-year-old who held all the pain, and Christine, a 3-year-old who would get sent to stand in the corner. And then there were the 2 alters who were absolutely critical to this case, Rajan and Adelina.
Ragan Vedaskovic was the protector. He was described as a Yugoslavian communist,
He spoke with that thick Slavic accent the victims remembered, and he was an expert in karate. He was filled with rage. In fact, his name comes from rage again. It was Rajan who committed the robberies, using his aggression and strength to protect the family, which is what the alters called themselves. He was the one the victims described as aggressive and foreign.
But the rapes, according to the psychiatric testimony, they were committed by someone else entirely. Adelana, a shy, lonely 19-year-old lesbian who was starved for affection and craved intimacy. The explanation given was that she didn't really understand the violent nature of her actions. She used Billy's body because she was desperate for human touch and warmth, a deeply twisted expression of an unmet need for connection.
So, with this absolutely astonishing diagnosis on the table, Milligan's lawyers put together a legal strategy that had never, ever been successfully used before in a major felony case.
And this gets right to the heart of the legal dilemma. If the main personality, William Milligan, was psychologically asleep, completely unaware that Rajan and Adelana were committing these crimes, could he be held responsible? Who exactly is the person that's on trial here?
The defense team argued for acquittal by reason of insanity, but in this brand new way. They weren't saying that Milligan was just broadly incompetent. They argued that the conscious self, the person who called himself Billy, lacked what's known in the law as mens rea, a guilty mind. He wasn't in control, he had no idea what was happening, and therefore he couldn't be held criminally responsible.
And incredibly, the court agreed. In a truly historic decision, Billy Milligan was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He became the very first person in United States history to be acquitted of a major felony by using dissociative identity disorder as a defense. So instead of going to prison, he was committed to a series of state-run mental hospitals for treatment. But that verdict wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. In fact, you could say it was just the beginning of a fierce, decades-long debate that's still going on today. So you had two camps. On one side, the majority of the clinical experts who actually examined Milligan were convinced. They pointed to the consistency of the alters, some of their unique physiological differences, and of course that well-documented history of abuse as clear evidence that this was a genuine trauma response. But on the other side, you had the skeptics. They argued Milligan was just a brilliant manipulator, a malingerer who cooked up the whole story after learning about the disorder to escape a long prison sentence. So what happened to Billy? Well, he spent the next 10 years in psychiatric care, going through intensive therapy to try and fuse all his personalities into a single cohesive identity. He was eventually released in 1988 and lived a mostly private life, though the shadow of his past was always there. He died of cancer in 2014, leaving behind a legacy of really powerful unanswered questions. The case's impact on our culture has been just immense. Daniel Keyes' best-selling book, The Minds of Billy Milligan, brought his story to a global audience. From there, it's inspired documentaries, TV shows, and it's still a cornerstone case study in psychology and law classrooms, forcing every new generation to grapple with what it all means. And that really brings us to our final thought here. This story of Billy Milligan forces us to confront some of the deepest questions we can possibly ask. You know, if a person's mind can fracture into many, what even is a self? If memories can be walled off and totally inaccessible, what is truth? And maybe the biggest question of all, if the person who committed a crime literally no longer exists, what is justice? The 24 faces of Billy Milligan might be gone, but the questions they raised are still very, very much with us.